Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Well, welcome to the program today. The first item that we are going to cover is the alleged handover, delivery of British Storm Shadow cruise missiles to the Ukrainians. Very interesting to hear about this. This is a very advanced weapon system that is used by the British, it's used by the French. And what's more interesting is how the Ukrainians would deploy those weapon systems. How would they launch Storm Shadows towards Russian targets? Well, the surface level thought is that they would mount Storm Shadows on MiG-29s, Su-27s, whatever Soviet-era aircraft the Ukrainians are operating, and they would launch the Storm Shadow from those systems. Now, is that what they really are doing? Are the Ukrainians the ones that are actually going to be launching the Storm Shadow missile? Or, I'm just saying, look, or is there a possibility that the handover, the reported handover, the announcement that the Brits would hand over Storm Shadows to the Ukrainians, cover for possible direct NATO involvement in Ukraine? Now look, I get it. Some of you are going to say that's preposterous, it's ridiculous. That would mean war with Russia. It would mean a third world war. But does it give NATO forces, does it give the United States, does it give the United Kingdom, France, does it give plausible deniability for Western use of Storm Shadow systems against Russian forces? I would have to say it does. If you look at MBDA's website, Storm Shadow Scalp has been put into operations with the Royal Air Force and the French Air Force in 2003 and was used in the Gulf, Iraq, and Libya. The weapon is now in service with 3 other nations, giving unrivaled deep strike capability. Storm Shadow Scalp is operated from Tornado, Rafale, Mirage 2000, and in the future, the Eurofighter Typhoon. Doesn't say the Scalp, doesn't say the Storm Shadow has the capability to be launched from older Soviet-era MiG-29s. Doesn't say that. Now, is it possible? Is it something that could happen? Sure, absolutely. But again, you have to ask questions. You have to look at this closely. And you have to understand what is happening on the ground in this war. And that's very, very important to do that. And unfortunately, at least here in the West and here in the United States, hard questions are not being asked by the media. I mean, quite literally, here in the United States, the head of our government, the president, some say would be the alleged president, Joe Biden, operates a crime syndicate. And very little is covered by the media, unfortunately. The big man crime syndicate. Anyway, I'm not going to deviate here, but it's worth noting. So very important to look at that, very important to understand how the Storm Shadow is going to be deployed, who's going to deploy it. Is it the Ukrainians or is it a third party? Difficult to say at this point. But another key point today I want to talk about is it is apparent, at least from Western media, that the Ukrainians could be delaying the start of this much heralded counteroffensive against Russian forces. Let's see here. Dateline. Ukraine says its counteroffensive now delayed. Britain says it sent cruise missiles to Kiev. Let's look at that article. Let's see what they're saying here. Because this is, again, as I've been talking about this for the last few days, it was very, very possible. President Zelensky said in remarks broadcast Thursday that Kiev is delaying its long-awaited counteroffensive against Russian occupying forces because Ukraine lacks enough Western weapons to succeed without suffering too many casualties. What did we talk about yesterday? That exact issue. Again, you heard it here. The Ukrainian battlefield commanders are very concerned about conducting large-scale offensive operations south of Orikhiv with the objective of taking Tokmak and eventually Melitopol. Very, very difficult situation. In fact, we know the Ukrainians have assembled about 3 very large battle groups comprising about 37,000 personnel. And the Ukrainians intend a multi-pronged strategy. The main effort would drive south of Orikhiv with the goal of seizing this town right here and then possibly moving on to Melitopol. At the same time, the Ukrainians would attempt crossings of the Dnieper River depending on how much success they have south of Orikhiv. So again, they're planning this multi-pronged operation, which looks like they plan on trying to sever the land corridor to Crimea and take back large amounts of territory. Now, some in the Ukrainian circles believe that this operation is too large. It is too grandiose, with a very high probability that Russian air power is going to negate this offensive by the Ukrainians. And we've seen it. We've seen the continued use of Russian air power. We're actually seeing a change in Russian doctrine. We're starting to see the Russians use its air force much like the United States and some Western European nations use its air force. More and more standoff attack capability, the use of GLONASS guided weapon systems with standoff range targeting key Ukrainian supply nodes, key Ukrainian staging areas, and that is what is stopping the Ukrainians from launching this counteroffensive. So it's a combination of things. It's the prospect of taking dire casualties in these very open fields south of Orikhiv, while at the same time the Russians are hitting these staging areas. They are attacking, they are bombing these supply points where the Ukrainians are amassing forces. It's not being talked about. It's not being discussed in the mainstream media. The mainstream media and even content providers here on YouTube would rather talk about this 1 kilometer strip of land that a company-sized Russian formation backed off on. Interesting. Very interesting. It's just incredibly interesting to see that this is taking center stage over the delayed offensive, counteroffensive by the Ukrainians. But more importantly, and this is very, very important, why the Ukrainians are hitting the pause button on this offensive, this counteroffensive. Again, Russia is adapting to the current methods of war. Namely, we're seeing that with the use of glide bombs and standoff weapon systems. Yes, the Ukrainians report that they shoot down 99.9% of every cruise missile that crosses into Ukrainian airspace. And the reason I laugh is it's nonsensical the way that is reported. The Russians launched 100 missiles and we shot down 99 of them. It just doesn't work like that. And that's not what's happening on the ground. Are they shooting down 50%? Maybe. But the Russians are getting cruise missiles through, and they are hitting targets. And it's causing casualties. And it's hurting the Ukrainians. And that's why, one of the reasons, we're not seeing this Ukrainian counteroffensive in the south of Kharkiv. That is why. So we're going to continue to watch what is happening with the Storm Shadow. I find that very interesting. There are weapon systems that the Ukraine... Look, if the Ukrainians have promised not to use the Storm Shadow out of Ukrainian occupied territory, meaning not hit Russian targets in Russia proper, then what is the purpose of handing those systems over? Because the Ukrainians have systems, they have weapon systems that can achieve that very mission. That stated mission of going after Russian targets in these areas. The areas you can see here in red and orange. They have that capability. But again, could the Storm Shadow be cover for something else? You have to ask this question again. What was happening in, say, the Korean War between Soviet pilots and American pilots was something that really wasn't reported about and reported on until after the war. Here in the United States, we, citizens of the United States, did not know that parts of Alaska was occupied by the Japanese until after the war. Could we hear 20 years from now that indeed American warplanes bombed Russian targets in this conflict? Is it possible? Is it possible? Is it unlikely? Maybe. But is it possible? Ask yourself that. So that covers it for today. Thank you for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Hope everyone enjoyed the program. More to come very soon. And as always, have a good day.